At the politics fundraiser, I saw my fiancé's whispering into the senator's ear. When she turned around, her smile vanished. The night of the fundraiser was supposed to be ordinary. Just another evening of champagne, polished speeches, and polite lies floating through the air. I'd been through dozens of them before. Political fundraisers were my job, my routine, my living. But that night, I walked into the Hilton ballroom a few minutes past 8 and felt something pull at the edges of the room. It wasn't the sound of the string quartet or the clinking glasses. It was her voice. Mara's. She stood near the senator's table, her posture graceful and deliberate, the kind of elegance she used like a weapon. From a distance, I could tell she was in her element. Hand on her hip, head tilted slightly as she leaned closer to Senator Holt. He was seated, looking up at her with that half-amused, half-interested look older men in power often had when they met someone who made them feel younger. I was too far to hear their words, but I didn't need to. The scene spoke for itself. The whispering, the laughter that looked too intimate to be about policy, none of it made sense to me. Mara wasn't supposed to be there in that tone, in that body language. She had told me the fundraiser would be strictly professional, a quick stop before she met a client downtown. Yet here she was, whispering into the senator's ear like a secret she didn't want the world to know. When she finally turned her head and saw me standing at the edge of the crowd, her expression collapsed. The smile she had been wearing just seconds earlier vanished like someone had flipped a switch. I saw her jaw tighten, the slightest flinch in her shoulders, the way her hand dropped from the senator's lapel as though it burned her. Holt noticed me too. His glance was lazy, amused, as if he found the situation mildly entertaining. I didn't approach them right away. I stood still, nodding mechanically to a couple of donors who came up to shake my hand, pretending to be part of the crowd, pretending not to see what I had just seen. But the image burned itself into my mind. Her lips close to his ear, her hand on his chest, the sudden panic in her face when she realized I'd caught her. When she walked toward me, she had already put her mask back on. Her smile looked practiced now, almost stiff. She said something about a networking moment, something about how Senator Holt appreciated her ideas on outreach. I nodded, pretending to listen. But all I could hear was the faint echo of that laugh, the one that didn't belong to the woman I thought I knew. We left early that night. The drive home was quiet except for the hum of the tires and the faint sound of her perfume filling the car, the same perfume she'd been wearing at the fundraiser. I remember the way she turned toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass, and said something about how I always misread ambition. It was the kind of line that sounded rehearsed, like she'd used it before, maybe even on someone else. I didn't argue. Arguing with Mara never went anywhere. She had this ability to twist the logic around until you questioned your own memory. I used to find it impressive. That night, it felt like a trap. When we got home, she disappeared into the bedroom, claiming exhaustion. I went to the kitchen, opened a beer, and stared at the dark window. My reflection looked calm, almost detached, but inside something had shifted. A subtle awareness, a small crack that didn't close. That's when I noticed her purse on the counter. She never left it there. Mara was meticulous. Every item had its place. She was the type who lined her shoes by color, who kept receipts organized by month. The purse, sitting open, forgotten, felt out of character. I didn't go looking for anything specific. Maybe I was hoping to prove myself wrong, to find something ordinary that would settle my thoughts. But when I reached inside, I found a phone, not the one she always carried, the one with the cracked corner and floral case. This one was sleek, black, unmarked. It didn't even have fingerprints on it. When I pressed the side button, the screen lit up. No lock screen photo, no notifications, just a clean wallpaper and a single calendar reminder. Private meeting. RH. Thursday, 7:30 p.m. I stared at the initials. RH. Senator Raymond Holt. My stomach sank. There were other entries, too, short ones. Call, 9 p.m., brunch follow-up. Meeting, room 1420. No full names, no details. Just vague notations spaced over the past month. I scrolled further and saw 2 text threads, both unnamed, both wiped clean except for the timestamps. Every few days, a single outgoing message, then deletion. Someone careful. Someone who knew how to hide a trail. I didn't take screenshots or write anything down. I just stared at it for a long time before placing it back exactly where I found it. I knew that if I confronted her that night, she'd have an explanation ready. Something about confidentiality, political strategy. You know how these circles work, Eli. And she'd look me in the eye, unblinking, until I doubted what I saw. I went to bed without saying a word. She was already asleep, or pretending to be. Her breathing was steady, her hand resting near the edge of the blanket. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting each inhale and exhale, wondering when ambition had started looking like betrayal. The next morning, She was all warmth again. Coffee on the counter, soft music, her voice breezy as if nothing had happened. She talked about her day, about a meeting with clients, about deadlines. When she kissed my cheek before leaving, it almost felt real. But once she was gone, I couldn't shake the image of her leaning close to Holt, whispering something I was never meant to hear. For the next few days, I watched patterns form. Late-night calls that ended when I entered the room. Emails she quickly minimized when I passed behind her. She said she was working on campaign branding for a senator's outreach program. Ironic, considering the man himself was already in her orbit. At my own office, I tried to focus. I worked with political consultants and donors. I knew how these worlds intertwined. It was easy to tell when someone was building a private connection outside the official chain. Mara had access, charm, and the kind of ambition that could turn dangerous if fed the wrong incentives. By Wednesday, she said she needed to travel to DC for a quick strategy session. I asked who was covering expenses, and she said the committee would reimburse her. That didn't make sense. She wasn't on any payroll related to Holt's campaign. I didn't press further. Instead, I asked her to forward me her flight info, pretending to need it for our shared calendar. She smiled and said she'd text it later. She never did. That night, while she packed, she hummed to herself, like everything was fine. But I noticed the new silk dress she slipped into her luggage, not something she'd wear to a business meeting. She left the next morning. I waited until her flight time had passed, then checked the airline's portal. Her name wasn't listed on any outbound flight under the reservation she mentioned. Something inside me steadied then, like a compass finally finding north. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't business. That evening, I went through the files at work, tracing connections between Holt's committee donors and the PR firms that handled his image. It was supposed to be professional curiosity, but I found something unusual. A donor named MNH Consulting listed in the internal memos. It didn't ring a bell. When I checked the registration address, my pulse quickened. It was a virtual office Mara had once rented for a freelance project. The same address appeared on a wire transfer form from a corporate donor routed through Holt's committee 2 weeks ago. I printed it out, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my jacket. Later that night, she texted saying she'd arrived safely, that the meeting had gone well, that she might stay an extra night for networking. I didn't reply. Instead, I went for a walk downtown, ending up near the Hilton, the same place as the fundraiser. The lights from its upper floors shimmered across the wet pavement. I remembered her laugh, the senator's expression, the way her smile had vanished the moment she saw me. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the building, realizing that whatever she was part of went beyond an affair. It wasn't just about romance or betrayal. It was power, the kind that corrupted quietly, without a trace. When I got home, her second phone was gone from the purse. Everything looked untouched, as if it had never existed. She returned 2 days later, cheerful and composed. She kissed me, told me about productive meetings, and said the senator had been impressed with her work. I listened, calm, detached, letting her words wash over me. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was the beginning of something larger, something that would unravel both of us. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the dark living room and opened my laptop. The document with MNH Consulting sat there like a quiet confession. I began listing names, donors, committees, transfer amounts, each line connecting back to her. And as the cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen, I realized I wasn't just tracking corruption. I was tracking the woman lying in my bed. The next week moved like static, silent, charged, and heavy with things unsaid. Mara acted as though nothing was wrong. She floated through the house with perfect control, calling donors, attending strategy brunches, and filling her planner with back-to-back meetings. She left lipstick prints on her coffee mugs and lipstick marks on shirts that didn't belong to me. I didn't accuse her. I observed. At work, I had access to information most people didn't. As a consultant, I managed logistics for multiple campaigns, which meant I saw the donors, the flows, and the small inconsistencies that got people ruined. I told myself I wasn't investigating her. I was just doing my job. But the lines blurred quickly. I began with the consulting firm address I'd found earlier, MNH Consulting. When I checked state records, I discovered it had been registered 6 months ago under an LLC structure with one managing partner listed, Mara Hensley. The paperwork was flawless, designed to look like a public relations startup, but it had no website, no social media presence, and no employees. What it did have was a series of payments from private donors linked to Senator Holt's re-election fund, communications retainers, each just under the reporting threshold. It was subtle enough to pass legal review, but obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. That was her brilliance. She hid in plain sight. 2 nights later, while reviewing quarterly financial disclosures for one of my clients, I saw Holt's name again. this time tied to a community development initiative. On the surface, it looked like a small charity drive, but the bank routing numbers led to a private trust in Delaware. The signatory? MNH Consulting. I printed another document and slid it into the growing folder in my drawer. Something bigger was forming, something neither of us had said aloud. Mara wasn't having an ordinary affair. She was part of a funnel, a pay-for-access arrangement, maybe even an unregistered lobbying network. She wasn't sleeping with Holt for love. She was doing it to climb. That realization made everything colder. The following weekend, Holt hosted another event. This one at charity brunch in the garden of the city's historic museum. I wasn't invited, but I knew Mara would be there. She said she was coordinating donors. Her voice on the phone that morning sounded casual, almost musical. I drove there anyway, parking across the street. I told myself I only wanted to make sure she was safe. That was a lie. I wanted to see what version of herself she'd become. Through the wrought iron fence, I spotted her near the main tent, wearing a pale blue dress I hadn't seen before. She looked like she belonged to another world. Standing beside her was not Holt, but his senior aide, a sharp man named Ben Wick. They spoke close, their posture telling. After a while, they left the main area, heading toward the rear parking lot. I followed from a distance. They didn't get into separate cars. They walked together toward the side entrance of the Roosevelt Hotel across the street. He pressed a hand to her back as they entered. I waited 20 minutes, maybe more, before leaving. That night, Mara came home hours later, smelling faintly of hotel soap and cigarette smoke. She said the brunch had run long and that Holt wanted a follow-up dinner to discuss donor retention. I nodded like I believed her. In truth, I didn't feel jealousy anymore. What I felt was clarity. Every move she made confirmed what I already knew. She was in deep, and she was comfortable there. The next few days, I began tracing Holt's network more aggressively. I called an old acquaintance, a lobbyist named Fred, who owed me a favor. He was the kind of man who always knew where the bodies were buried. When I mentioned Holt's name, he laughed, said the senator had a taste for complicated women. When I pushed for details, Fred hesitated, then asked if I'd seen the file. I didn't know what file he meant. 2 days later, an encrypted email appeared in my inbox with no sender. Inside was a compressed folder labeled RH, Private Communications. Inside that were photos, grainy surveillance stills from what looked like the senator's office. Holt and Mara, sitting close together on the couch, a glass of wine between them. Another shot showed them in an embrace, time-stamped late at night, long after staff hours. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. The photos weren't just evidence of an affair. They were proof of the connection between their personal and financial entanglements. She wasn't just his companion. She was his broker, connecting money to power, clients to favors, influence to intimacy. When Mara came home that evening, she seemed unbothered, almost glowing. She mentioned Holt's upcoming televised interview and how it could shift public sentiment. She talked about strategy as if nothing had changed. I kept my silence, but inside I began forming a plan. I knew that confronting her outright would end with manipulation. She'd cry, she'd explain, she'd find a way to make me complicit. But there was one thing Mara underestimated. I was good at patterns. I knew how to build narratives out of scattered fragments. Over the next week, I quietly collected what I needed. Bank transfers, meeting logs, anonymous reports, all of it pointing to a triangle between Holt, Mara, and MNH Consulting. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it, but I knew one day soon I'd need it. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual. The apartment smelled like perfume and tension. She was on the balcony, talking on the phone. When she saw me, she turned away slightly, lowering her voice. I caught pieces of her words. Donor list. He promised discretion, transfer tonight. She ended the call abruptly and smiled at me, the kind of smile meant to erase memory. She said it was just business. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city hummed outside, restless and indifferent. Around 3 a.m, I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and started typing. I wrote down everything I'd learned, every document, every date. It wasn't an official report. It was more like an insurance policy, a record in case everything collapsed. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. If she wanted to build her kingdom in whispers, I'd build my answer in silence. I sent a message to one of Holt's rival campaigns, an encrypted email from an anonymous address. I attached a few innocuous pages, nothing incriminating yet, just enough to draw attention. It was a risk, but I knew what I was doing. Information was currency in politics, and I was about to spend some. The next day, Mara received a message that made her pale. I saw it as she read it across the table. Something about reviewing committee transfers. Her fork froze midair. She excused herself and spent the next hour pacing in the hallway, making calls. When she returned, she tried to act calm, saying there had been a misunderstanding. But that night, she barely touched her dinner. She spent hours on her laptop, her fingers tapping with quiet panic. Over the following days, I watched her world begin to fracture. Holt stopped returning her calls. His aide ignored her emails. Meetings were canceled without explanation. She grew restless, snapping at me for trivial things, accusing me of distraction, of not believing in her. Then, one evening, while we were sitting at opposite ends of the living room, she said something that revealed more than she intended. She mentioned deals and covering for him, and that they'd better not throw her under the bus. That was when I understood she already saw the betrayal coming, not from me, but from the man she'd chosen to serve. By that weekend, whispers had started in political circles. Donor funds unaccounted for, committee discrepancies, missing invoices. Mara's name hadn't surfaced publicly yet, but she could feel the storm gathering. One night, she came home late, eyes red, her voice shaking as she said everything was under control. She poured herself a drink and stared out the window for a long time. I didn't say a word. In her reflection, I saw the same look she'd given me at the fundraiser, the sudden panic when she realized she'd been caught. The pieces were aligning exactly as I expected. She had built her success on leverage and deceit, and now that web was tightening around her. I only had to wait. By the end of that week, Holt's rival campaign made a public statement demanding transparency in donor relations. The senator's office released a bland denial, but the damage was done. The investigation had begun. Mara woke early that morning, staring at her phone like it might explode. She asked if I'd heard anything, if anyone from my firm had mentioned her name. I told her I hadn't. Inside, I was calm in a way that felt dangerous, because I knew this was only the beginning. When the first headline appeared, it was small, buried deep in the business section of a local political paper. Anonymous source alleges misuse of donor funds in Holt campaign. The article mentioned no names, no specifics, but it carried just enough weight to rattle the right people. Within 24 hours, it spread. Other outlets began quoting it. Reporters circled, whispering the senator's name, questioning his transparency, digging into financial disclosures that had seemed spotless just weeks before. At home, Mara pretended everything was fine. She smiled too wide at breakfast, talked too quickly, scrolled through her phone between every sentence. Her confidence had turned brittle. I could feel it in the air, like glass about to crack. She was still trying to reach Holt, leaving voicemails that grew shorter and sharper with every call. The senator's office had gone dark. No return messages. No invitations. No warmth. She had built herself into his shadow, and now he'd stepped out of it, leaving her standing alone. 2 days later, Holt held a press conference. The cameras caught every detail, the crisp navy suit, the controlled tone, the casual charm of a man who'd survived too many scandals to care about another. He denied wrongdoing, promised cooperation, and subtly shifted the narrative toward rogue consultants acting independently. I didn't need him to name her. The subtext did the work. That evening, she came home looking pale, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She didn't even remove her coat. She just stood in the doorway, staring at nothing, muttering that she'd been cut off, that they'd hung her out to dry. I asked who. She didn't answer. For days, the tension thickened. Calls came at odd hours. She whispered in the hallway, pacing barefoot, her voice breaking between anger and fear. I didn't intervene. I'd learned that silence was stronger than confrontation. It made her fill the void with panic. By midweek, the rival campaign had obtained financial documents, ones remarkably similar to the ones I'd leaked. Only this time, they came with commentary and follow-ups from anonymous staffers. The phrase MNH Consulting appeared in the public record for the first time. The story detonated overnight. Local news anchors said the firm was possibly linked to a private consultant with personal ties to the senator. That was enough. Within hours, her name began trending. Photos from past events surfaced, her shaking Holt's hand, laughing at panels, sitting close during interviews. The captions wrote themselves. At dawn, Mara's phone exploded with messages. Some from journalists, others from former colleagues, a few from people pretending to sympathize. She ignored most of them, but I saw one notification flash across her screen. You've been named in an ethics review. The silence that followed was unbearable. She finally turned to me and asked if I believed she was guilty. I said nothing. The truth sat between us, thick and alive. That night, she drank. Not the poised, measured sips she used to take at fundraisers, but long, trembling gulps straight from the bottle. She spoke in fragments, about loyalty, about opportunity, about how everyone in politics cut corners, how she had only done what the system rewarded. Her face crumpled when she realized Holt hadn't called. She cursed him, cursed the papers, cursed herself for trusting him. By morning, her name was everywhere. Political consultant accused of facilitating off-book donations. Holt associate under scrutiny for financial misconduct. Ethics panel to review alleged kickback network. The senator distanced himself with expert precision. His official statement described her as an independent contractor whose personal actions did not reflect the campaign's standards. He didn't deny knowing her. He just erased her. That afternoon, she collapsed on the couch, eyes hollow, whispering that she could fix it, that if she explained, people would understand, that it was all professional. The TV was still on when Holt appeared for another interview. I stood behind her as the screen flickered. The anchor asked about the accusations, about Mara, about whether he had any relationship with her beyond business. He smiled. That same lazy, dismissive smile I'd seen the night she whispered into his ear. He said he'd never comment on rumors and that the investigation would prove his innocence. Then he added something that made her hands tremble. He said, "It's unfortunate that some individuals allow ambition to lead them astray. I wish her the best." The words landed like a blade. She stared at the screen until her eyes watered. Then she threw the remote, shattering the glass coffee table. The sound echoed through the apartment. She screamed that he couldn't do this to her, that she had everything on him, proof of every transaction, every night he'd called her for strategy. But proof doesn't matter when your enemy controls the story. I watched her unravel in real time. The woman who once calculated every sentence now couldn't finish one. She was angry, terrified, humiliated. Her reputation had been built on the illusion of control, and now everyone saw her as reckless, corrupt, disposable. Later that week, an anonymous folder appeared in my work inbox. It contained hundreds of internal emails from Holt's office, some genuine, some clearly leaked to shift blame toward her. They painted her as the mastermind behind every shady deal. The narrative was clear. She'd seduced the senator, manipulated donors, and pocketed money. The public loved it. It had scandal, sex, and betrayal, everything politics fed on. By Friday, her clients dropped her. The PR firm she freelanced for suspended her indefinitely. Even her friends, people who'd toasted her at parties, stopped answering her calls. One night, she stormed into my study, demanding to know if I'd spoken to anyone. I told her I hadn't. She didn't believe me. She shouted that I looked too calm, that maybe I'd known it would happen. Her paranoia was so raw it almost made me pity her. Almost. She accused me of enjoying her downfall. I said she was giving herself too much credit. The truth was simpler. I wasn't enjoying it. I was documenting it. Watching cause and effect unfold like a proof I already knew the solution to. Days later, Holt's wife filed for legal separation. The tabloids went wild. They printed excerpts from her court filings, hinting that her husband's indiscretions went beyond rumor. Holt's approval rating plunged. His opponents called for an ethics hearing. For the first time, the story shifted. Reporters began questioning whether Holt had exploited Mara, whether she was another casualty of his power. Mara saw the coverage as a lifeline. She called a lawyer, hoping to negotiate immunity in exchange for testimony. But she was too late. The committee had already moved to subpoena her records. That same night, she sat across from me, quiet for once. Her eyes were swollen, her makeup gone. She said she didn't blame me for hating her. She admitted she'd made mistakes, that she'd wanted too much too fast. She said Holt promised her everything: visibility, power, connections, and she believed him because he made her feel like she mattered. I didn't respond. I just studied the woman across from me. The same woman who once stood at a fundraiser, whispering into a senator's ear like she owned the room. Now, she couldn't even own her reflection. She reached for my hand. I didn't move. She whispered that she'd fix it, that she'd find a way out, that she still loved me. I stayed still until she withdrew. By the next morning, reporters were parked outside the building. Cameras waited at the entrance. Her face was everywhere. News alerts, push notifications, cable debates. The scandal had gone national. She closed herself in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone like she was searching for a version of herself that hadn't been erased yet. That evening, the senator issued one more statement. He was stepping down for personal reasons. The networks played it in a loop. Mara watched, her lips trembling, whispering that she never wanted this, that she just wanted to be part of something big. I wanted to tell her she was part of something big, just not in the way she imagined. That night, as the city flickered outside our window, I realized there was nothing left to do. The story had already written itself, and like every political scandal, it would swallow its players whole before moving on to the next. I shut down my laptop, leaving the folder of evidence untouched. Tomorrow, the world would know everything, and she would know that I never once raised my voice. Only let her own actions echo until they became unbearable. By the time the investigation reached its peak, Mara's name had become shorthand for political disgrace. News anchors said it like a warning, Late-night hosts turned it into punchlines, and pundits used it as a case study in hubris. Every photo of her at a gala or beside Holt became evidence, every smile a headline. The woman who once charmed rooms into silence now couldn't enter one without it going quiet for another reason entirely. Our apartment turned into a war bunker of unopened letters, legal notices, and ignored calls. She stopped answering the door, stopped eating properly, stopped pretending she had control. I still went to work each morning, moving through my routine as if nothing around me was collapsing. My colleagues asked polite questions about how she was holding up. I gave vague, distant answers. They understood without pressing. Politics was a small world. Everyone knew how fast it could devour its own. One evening, a soft knock echoed at the door. When I opened it, two investigators stood there, polite but sharp, holding folders. They asked if I could verify that Mara had managed MNH Consulting. I didn't lie, but I didn't volunteer more than necessary. They thanked me and left with quiet efficiency. When I closed the door, she was standing behind me, pale as paper, her hands trembling. She asked if I'd told them anything. I said no. It was true enough. The next morning, she disappeared without saying where she was going. Hours later, I turned on the television and saw her walking up courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters. She looked composed, hair tied neatly, dark sunglasses, the calm expression of someone rehearsing dignity. She gave no statements. By evening, the charges were announced: campaign fraud, wire misreporting, and obstruction of financial oversight. Nothing violent, nothing cinematic, just bureaucratic words that translated to ruin. When she returned home that night, she didn't cry. She didn't rage either. She simply sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the pattern in the wood. She said the lawyers wanted to make her a deal: partial immunity in exchange for full cooperation. Holt had already started distancing himself legally, claiming she acted alone. She laughed then, an empty, broken sound that barely reached her own ears. She asked me if I'd testify against her if they called me. I said I'd testify for the truth. That seemed to hurt more than anything else. Weeks passed in fragments. Some days she tried to fight, calling journalists, emailing colleagues, trying to rebuild her version of events. Other days, she stayed in bed, blinds drawn, the glow of her phone the only light in the room. The contrast between those two Maras, the defiant and the defeated, was almost poetic. Then came the morning when the full set of Holt's private emails leaked. It was a slow, methodical disaster. The content left no ambiguity. He had used Mara as a bridge to donors, a middleman for illicit transfers. Her name appeared dozens of times, but so did his. There were thank yous, coded messages, and even attachments proving she had followed his direct orders. For the first time, the public turned on him. Protests flared outside his office. Donors withdrew. Within 48 hours, he resigned to protect his family. The resignation statement included a single line of gratitude to those who worked tirelessly in service of my campaign. It was another way of saying this isn't my fault. But the leaks also did something unexpected. They changed Mara's story. Suddenly, she wasn't the lone villain. She was part of a machine. Commentators debated whether she was complicit or coerced. For a moment, pity found her. Small, brief, but real. Her lawyer capitalized on it. They framed her as the scapegoat, a young consultant crushed under the weight of a corrupt mentor. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. The final hearing took place in spring. The courtroom smelled like cold air and polished wood. I sat behind the press row, silent, watching her on the stand. Her voice was steady when she spoke. She admitted to authorizing transactions, denied knowledge of the full scheme, and subtly redirected blame toward Holt's senior staff. The prosecutor pressed, but she didn't break. When my name was called, I took the oath and told the truth, the version that was factual but not cruel. I confirmed her role, her proximity, her signature on certain filings. I avoided speculation. I didn't expose the nights of deception, the second phone, or the whispers at the fundraiser. I left that between us. Afterward, she wouldn't look at me. The case concluded quietly. Holt negotiated immunity by surrendering his assets and leaving public life. Mara accepted a plea deal: 18 months of probation, community service, and permanent disqualification from campaign work. Not prison, but still a kind of exile. When it was over, she sold what remained of her things and moved out of the city. I didn't ask where. One morning, I found her key on the counter beside a folded note that simply said, "You were right about everything." There was no signature. She knew I'd recognize the handwriting. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded. The media moved on to newer scandals, fresher faces. Holt's seat was filled by his former rival, the same man whose campaign had quietly benefited from my anonymous leaks. He offered my firm a long-term contract soon after. The irony wasn't lost on me. I accepted. Sometimes, late at night, I drive past the Hilton Ballroom, the same one where it began. It was still used for fundraisers, still filled with people pretending to be noble while trading favors in plain sight. From the outside, it looked identical. Inside, the faces changed, the games repeated. Once, I parked across the street and just watched through the glass. A new senator's fundraiser was in full swing. A young woman stood near the stage, laughing, leaning in close to whisper something to a man in a tailored suit. The image was painfully familiar. I left before she turned around. Life went on. I rebuilt my career, kept my distance from the world Mara had burned down. Sometimes I received postcards with no return address, short messages written in her careful script. They never said where she was or what she was doing. Only cryptic lines like, "I finally understand ambition," or "Power doesn't listen, it consumes." I never replied. There was nothing left to say. Years later, when I read that Holt had died quietly in a coastal villa abroad, I didn't feel satisfaction. Only inevitability. That was how men like him disappeared. Too rich to be punished, too tainted to be remembered. Mara, on the other hand, became a ghost. People spoke of her name only in whispers, an anecdote, a cautionary tale. Some said she'd started over under a different name. Others swore she'd left the country altogether. I never saw proof. Some truths are better left unconfirmed. Still, there are nights when I see her in my mind as she was that first evening, standing beneath the golden chandeliers, whispering into the senator's ear, the world bending toward her like she owned it. Then she turns, catches my eye, and her smile vanishes all over again. That image has never left me, and maybe it never will.